Hello everyone, my name is Jane Nicholson-Bith. I'm the Event Manager at the Institute of Leadership and Management. I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar. It's my pleasure to introduce Catherine Nicholson. Catherine is Director and Training Consultant with virtual training team, the Red Training Limited, where she helps organisations create face-to-face and virtual learning programmes that transform how employees engage and develop. Catherine, over to you.
Thank you, Jane. Yeah, absolutely. In my capacity as Director and Consultant at the Red Training Team, where we specialise in face-to-face training, I get involved in lots of face-to-face meetings. I'm also Director and Consultant at the Virtual Training Team, and we specialise there in virtual training. So I'm involved in lots of virtual meetings. And like you, I have a good idea of what a good meeting feels like and what a bad meeting feels like. And today we're going to spend a little bit of time exploring some good practice, reminding ourselves of those great ideas that we've maybe heard of and used in the past, but perhaps fallen out of favour with. Maybe we've fallen into some bad habits when it comes to running and organising our meetings. And today's an opportunity to grasp those meetings, get proactive and make them really productive. You know what a great meeting feels like? It feels energising. People are focused. We leave the meeting with a spring in our step, feeling that it was a good use of our time, it was cost effective and it made a difference. So let's think about how we can achieve that with our own meetings. So before we do that, just creating a bit of context. So the Institute of Leadership and Management have identified 5 dimensions of what it means to be a great leader. And underpinning these 5 dimensions are 49 components. And for each of those components, we've created a webinar to help you really drive your own leadership development learning. Today, we're exploring the 5th dimension, which is collaboration. A collaborative leader networks. A collaborative leader is great with people, building relationships, involving people, including people, engaging with people, and managing differences. And so underpinning the collaboration dimension, that 11 components. And today, the component that we're focusing on in this webinar is running meetings. Let me share with you some research that was published just a few years ago from the National Statistics Council. In their research, they found that the average manager spends per calendar month time in 60 meetings. 60 meetings a month. How does that compare to your world? Are you having 60 meetings a month? Maybe more, maybe less, but it's a lot of time to be spending in meetings. But it's not a lot of time to spend in meetings if they're productive, but it is a lot of time if they're not productive. And in this same piece of research, they found that 91% of the people they surveyed admitted that they had daydreamed in meetings. Have you ever daydreamed in meetings? Me, never. That's a lie, of course. 73% of people that they surveyed also admitted to bringing other work into the meeting that wasn't relevant. You know, maybe I'll find a bit of time to catch up on this email or produce this list or edit this, this spreadsheet. Now, if you're super focused in a meeting, you wouldn't dream of doing other work because you're involved and engaged. So these are examples of bad meetings, and there are too many bad meetings going on, and we can change that because as a collaborative leader, we can make sure that the meetings that happen in our environment that we're involved in are productive meetings, that they're a good use of our time. And if we have a culture of running productive meetings, then there's a good idea, or a good chance at least, that we'll be running productive organisations. Maybe there's a link there. So where do we start? Well, the agenda for today, we've got lots of things to consider. First of all, we'll think about what types of meetings can we run. Not all meetings are the same, and we have a whole menu of meetings to choose from. We'll also consider what happens before a meeting. If you plan a meeting well and really think about what happens beforehand, then you can prime your meeting attendees to arrive in the right frame of mind so you can really hit the ground running. But not all meetings go to plan. So what about those disruptive people that maybe derail our meetings? How do we manage those? Well, we've got some ideas to share with you around how we can do just that. So let's start with a few quotes around what do good meetings look like. So this first one here on the left by Alan Barker, his book is called How to Manage Meetings. And he says that a meeting is a group of people thinking purposefully together. I'd like to think that a good meeting is a group of people thinking purposefully together. I'm sure we've all been in meetings that don't quite look like that. And if you look at what Paul Axtell says, this was from his book Meeting Matters. Meetings are at the heart of an effective organisation, and each meeting is an opportunity to clarify issues, set new directions, sharpen focus, create alignment, and move objectives forward. That's what we can create if we get our meetings right. So before we even decide to run a meeting, there are certain considerations to think about. And the first one is purpose. So here in the middle of your screen, what is the purpose of my meeting? If you've been invited to a meeting, again, what is the purpose of the meeting and is it relevant to you? It's really important that for ourselves and for our meeting attendees, we're crystal clear on the purpose of the meeting. And then we link that to the outcome. What are we trying to achieve? So perhaps the purpose of the meeting is to discuss budget XYZ. Fine. But how do we know we've got to the end of the meeting? How do we know it's been a success? What's the outcome that we're looking to achieve? So maybe the outcome is to agree what the budget is. Now, once we're super clear on the purpose and the outcome, we can then decide who do we need to be involved in that meeting in order to achieve that outcome. We can also then start to prepare the meeting with a super laser beam focus on the purpose so that everything drives towards achieving the outcome that the meeting is set to achieve. So once we're clear on why we're running the meeting, what, where, when, how, and who needs to be there, we can start to think about, well, what should the meeting look like? And there are all sorts of different types of meetings that we can run these days, beyond the obvious. And they fall into a few different categories. So formal and informal, first of all. So what's a formal meeting? Well, there's a few examples here on your screen that you will recognise, but generally we think of a formal meeting as being a meeting that has a time and a date agreed in advance. Maybe there's an agenda that we circulate, so we've got a plan as to what will happen in the meeting that we decide in advance. We'll probably have somebody in charge of running the meeting, so a formal chair or facilitator. And you would imagine that usually in a formal meeting, there's some form of documentation that goes on. So documentation of actions, outcomes, decisions. And they could take all sorts of different formats. So it could be a team meeting. It could be a virtual meeting that's still a formal meeting. It could be about sitting down and really brainstorming and bashing some ideas around or solving problems. In addition to formal meetings, there are informal meetings as well. Now, sometimes we don't even think of an informal meeting as a meeting per se, but it's a gathering of people, one or more people, virtually or face-to-face, to discuss something. So it could even just be like a water cooler moment where you give somebody a bit of feedback or test them out on an idea. It's still a meeting, it's still got a purpose, but it's something that happens more spontaneously, perhaps. Now we can have international meetings and away days as well that could be more complex than the meetings that we can see on the screen right now. But the trick here is to think, what's the right format for the meeting that we've decided needs to happen based on our purpose, our people, and the outcomes that we want to achieve. Okay, so where are we? We've decided on our purpose and who needs to be there, and we've decided on what format the meeting should take. So now it's time to plan the meeting, a stage that's often overlooked beyond sending out a calendar invite. You know, how many meetings have you turned up to where people have rocked into the room and said, okay, so what's the thing today? Why are we here again? We can really get meetings to be super focused if we plan them well. So here are a few tips for you to think about what you might consider in planning a meeting. And the first point is whether or not a meeting should be required at all. Okay, let's just backtrack. How often have you been in a situation where maybe you've had a conversation with a colleague and it's like, yeah, we really should discuss that. Okay, let's book a meeting. Let's book a meeting room. And typically meetings tend to be of an hour or half an hour or 2 hours or half a day, like a particular chunk of time. But does it need to be a meeting? Could we maybe just go for a coffee or pick up the phone? And if there's a few people involved, still, it might not be necessary that an actual meeting is required. Maybe you could do some solicitation of ideas via email or over the phone. So always challenge, is a meeting required? Because it's not always the best or most, I guess, most productive or effective way to reach a solution sometimes. The next thing is about being super clear about the objectives. So we talked about this already. Every meeting should have a clear purpose. And if we're really clear on the purpose, then we can create an agenda that drives us to that. Why would anything be on the agenda that doesn't move us forwards to achieving the outcome that this meeting should achieve? So we can really start to edit the agenda, prioritize our agenda, and make sure that everything on there is relevant. And that also the people who are coming are super clear before their meeting as to what the purpose and outcomes are, so they can decide whether it's relevant that they should be there as well. They can do their prep as well. So on the topic of prep, make sure that we, if we're organising or facilitating the meeting, are really clear on what preparation is required. Is there any pre-reading that would be helpful for people to do prior to the meeting, so we're not having to explain things during the meeting? It's also really helpful if we can get people to take ownership of making, when 80% of the people in the meeting have done their pre-reading, 20% come in and say, oh, what is it again? Can you just recap on what we're supposed to know? No, actually, because that's a waste of meeting time. That should have happened before the meeting. Next up, we've got this idea of inviting the right people. This is really important. And in fact, let me just share with you a quote. So this is a quote from Camille Preston. This is from an article that she published in Forbes called How to Better Manage Your Meetings This Year. So let me just read this out to you. So she says in her article, ensure that anyone invited to a meeting really needs to be there and has something substantial to contribute. If they can be briefed later instead, don't invite them. If you do invite them, you're not likely not only to be wasting their time since they have nothing to contribute, wasting your time, but also you're wasting their time as well. I've been in meetings before where people have said nothing, absolutely nothing. And a little later, we'll talk about Elon Musk from Tesla fame. And he says, if somebody is in your meeting that isn't contributing, tell them to leave. It's a waste of time and a waste of money than being there. He's quite forthright in the way that he approaches his meetings, but I think he's got a good point. If somebody can't participate in a meeting or is unwilling to, or is just there to maybe come along for the ride, then why are they there? Maybe you've had experience of what I call meeting groupies before. You know, those people that they just want to be involved. It's like a power thing, an ego thing, a knowledge is power thing. They're frightened of missing out, and so they try and get involved in as many meetings as possible, but they don't really add any value. Don't invite them if you can help it. So what else have we got around people? Okay, so sometimes there's a really important person that should be in the meeting. Maybe they have the power to make a decision, but they're not available for the meeting. What do we do then? Well, sometimes they can replace themselves with a stand-in, and that might be okay if that stand-in has the relevant authority to make a decision. But if they can't, then sometimes it means we can't actually hit the outcome of the meeting, and maybe we need to set a different meeting time in order to involve that person. Consider who needs to be there and who doesn't need to be there as well. Too many people in a meeting is difficult to manage. And there's one school of thought that once the meeting hits 13 people, then we start to fragment into smaller meetings and smaller conversations. Think about the political element as well. So are people there because they have their own agenda, they want to stay in the loop, or are they able to add something of value? And then think about yourself. Do you need to be there? We get a bit trigger happy, don't we? Especially when you get these meeting invites come through and we just go, yep, and we hit yes, and we find ourselves in a meeting. And the way that Outlook works these days, other people can actually book our time. I know we still need to accept it, but it's so easy to accept it without question. So maybe we should be challenging, do I really need to be at this meeting? And if I do I need to be there for the whole meeting? Which are the agenda items where I can add value and contribute? And maybe I'll come along for those. I find quite often I get invites to an element, I mean, just a part of the meeting, and maybe it's a day-long away day. And it's like, hey, stay for the whole day if you want, come and see what we're up to. And it's tempting because it's fun, but it's a waste of my time. I'll go for the element of the meeting that I can add value to, and that's it. So really think about, should you be there? Okay, so next think about the actual venue, the environment, and seating arrangements. Sometimes a really formal environment is fine, and it's often easy because we may have meeting rooms available to us, but it's not always conducive to our brains. Think about if you want a meeting where you want people to be creative, generate new ideas. Is a stuffy formal boardroom the place to do that? Maybe we could get creative with our venue. Take it outside, off site. Go to the canteen or a coffee shop. Or even if there's just a small number of you, you could even do a walking meeting. Let's walk and talk, see where that takes us. What about the temperature? If you've got a warm, stuffy room on an afternoon, it's really not good for the brain when you start to get those drooping eyelids when people have their afternoon lull, which is worse when it's warm. It's really important. So what else do we need to think about in terms of the venue and seating arrangements? Well, a little later when we talk about disruptive meeting attendees, we'll start to think about how we seat them, because that can be quite important too. Finally, in terms of planning the meeting, think about your technical stuff. So by this, have you got a presentation, for example, or some multimedia that you need to use within the meeting, or maybe somebody else does? Always test it out, just check that it all works, and have a backup. Always have a backup. I found myself last week in a meeting environment. I often present from my iPad, which is great, and I have a VGA and a HDMI adapter for my iPad to plug into various different projectors and TVs. Last week, the way that I needed to connect was via a USB, which I don't have on my iPad as a connector, but don't worry, the day was saved because as a backup, I had my presentation on a USB stick because it was important. So if it's important, think about your backup. So quite a lot to think about there in terms of planning the meeting. But if we get this right, we can really hit the ground running. People should come primed, ready for a really productive and focused meeting. The environment's right, the people are right. Let's make it a success. So what next? We've talked about planning the meeting. What about the meeting itself? So let's think about running the meeting. And first of all, just in terms of running a meeting, let's just check in again and think who should be running the meeting. Often as managers and leaders, often as the most senior person, we feel that it should be a role that we undertake. But why? Maybe somebody else in your team could run the meeting, especially if you want to be a part of the meeting. Sometimes if you're a meeting attendee and facilitator, it can create a little bit of confusion. People might defer to you and it might not be an even conversation. But if you are running the meeting, here are some ideas to help you make it a success. So first of all, start and finish on time. You can get some really bad meeting etiquette and cultures that build and grow when people don't start meetings on time. If we've got two people that are late, do we wait for them or do we start on time? Well, if we wait for them, it sets a precedent sometimes, doesn't it? And maybe people feel that it's okay to rock up late and then the start time gets creeping for every meeting. So maybe just start on time and then people will get the idea that your meetings always start on time and they'll start to be on time themselves, hopefully. Also finish on time. No one will ever thank you for a meeting that overruns. So keeping the meeting on track throughout, and we'll talk about that a bit more in a moment, but keeping that meeting on track throughout means that the meeting should be pacey, but not rushed or hurried. And we finish on time, having covered thoroughly all the agenda items that we needed to cover. This is really important. Oops. Trigger happy there myself. So ensure that everyone has the opportunity to participate and listen to others, and also encourage the views of quieter members. So if you are taking on the role of facilitator, within your remit is to ensure that there's a balance of contribution. So those people that have a lot to say get to say what they need to say, but they're not domineering the conversation. We bring in those quieter members, we give them some airtime. I often think of it as being a bit like a police officer controlling the traffic when we're facilitating. That's what you can do to make sure that everyone participates. And I would argue that if you do have, as I said, somebody that isn't participating, you might want to challenge why they're there and why they're not participating. What else? Keep the meeting on track in terms of time and focus. So I've got a few tips here around how you might do that. So first of all, think about your agenda items and think about what timing each agenda item is likely to require. And then maybe give a bit of a buffer, because often things don't stick exactly to time depending on what people have to say. So know where you can squeeze and edit your agenda. What often happens in agendas is the most important agenda items are left towards the end of the meeting. But unfortunately, that's often when we're starting to run out of time. So how about flipping it? Maybe dealing with the most important agenda items at the start of the meeting means that if time does become a bit tight at the end, it's okay, because it's the less important agenda items that are squeezed or moved on to the next meeting. Another can of worms that can open up during a meeting is any other business, that agenda item that often lurks at the bottom of our agenda. I know some people that remove that completely, and their argument is, and I tend to agree with them, is if you're circulating your agenda before the meeting, if there's anything missing, your meeting attendees can give you advance warning and let you know that actually this is something that maybe should be on there, so we can edit and update the agenda. If it's important to be discussed and it comes up in any other business, then maybe that's the time to car park it, or say, actually, if it's important, let's make it an agenda item for our next meeting. But it wasn't on the agenda, we don't have time for it. So just think about that. Also, think about reiterating the purpose of the meeting. If things go off track, if tangents appear, red herrings occur in your conversations that you're having in your meetings, a reminder of the purpose of the meeting. Everyone, here's our agenda. This is what we're setting out to achieve. If it contributes to that, great. If it doesn't, let's drop it or move it to another day. Manage conflict. Conflict in meetings is actually quite healthy, because we need to have differences of opinions and diverse viewpoints. We might need to step in, though, as facilitator when those differences of opinion become a bit more of a difference of opinion and more of a conflict or an argument. So that is our role actually as facilitator, to just manage that, just as a good host of a party would step in if a few guests were getting a little bit frustrated with each other. Support effective record keeping. So a tip that I use here is, if I'm running a meeting, I like to make the notes and the actions very public for everyone to see on a flip chart or projected on a screen, and that way everyone can see and agree it there and then we can just send it out via email afterwards. And of course, we need to just keep our eye on any actions that have been agreed. So what about those difficult people that emerge sometimes? They're a bit argumentative, side meetings are domineering the session. Well, they do happen. Maybe if you know that they're going to be a little difficult, maybe taking them to one side prior to the meeting to just prime them as to your expectations of their role very carefully, giving them a bit of feedback. Remember your role as facilitator, because your job is to manage these people. So sometimes we really need to step in and be assertive, having that difficult conversation. Have a break. You know, sometimes just taking a break can change the dynamic of what's happening in the session. And also think about giving some difficult people a role. If they're quite tricky, maybe have them run the meeting. There's an idea. Or they keep the minutes and record actions, or they have an agenda item. But if they're involved in some sort of role within the meeting, they've got a vested interest in it being a success. And finally, think of your seating plan. If you've got two people who generally get into conflict with each other, if they sit opposite each other, opposite them each other across a table, it's easier to have conflict with each other. So consider putting them maybe on the same side of the table with a few people in between. If they can't physically see each other that easily, it's more difficult for them to argue. Just as if you've got someone that's quite domineering, try and avoid putting them at the head of the table, because that just puts them in charge and really reinforces that domineering style that they might have. So let's finally take a quote from Elon Musk. I mentioned him earlier on. He's got some really strong views about meetings, and he was concerned about the productivity at Tesla and decided to address this in part in how people got involved in meetings. So let's just take a read of this quite quickly. So excessive meetings, he said, are the blight of big companies and almost always get worse over time. He says, please get out of all large meetings unless you're certain that they're providing value to the whole audience, in which case keep them very short. He says also get rid of frequent meetings unless you're dealing with an extremely urgent matter. Meeting frequency should drop rapidly once the urgent matter is resolved. And he gets really bold here. Walk out of a meeting or drop off a call as soon as it is obvious you aren't adding value. He says it's not rude to leave, but it is rude to make someone stay and waste their time. So food for thought there. Lots of food for thought in terms of running your meetings throughout this webinar. And what I really encourage you to do is to consider just getting proactive. Don't let meetings be something that happen to you. Let meetings be something that you make happen. Drive them, keep that purpose in mind, be assertive and facilitate strongly. And hopefully you will find your meetings getting more and more productive. So good luck with that, and thank you. And Jane, I'll hand back over to you.
Thank you, Catherine. That was fantastic. I've got a couple of questions. What advice do you have for meetings that go all over the place and completely off topic? How can you bring it back without offending anybody?
Okay, I'm guilty of that myself. Sometimes I am the one that goes off topic. And I'm often quite grateful when somebody reminds me of that. It's like, sorry. So I think if people just say, great, it's valuable what you're saying, perhaps are interesting, let's just remind ourselves of why we're here today. If it's something that needs more discussion, let's take it offline, let's talk about it later, or let's talk about it over the break or in that social time. You know, before and after meetings, when we are having that social conversation over a coffee, is often when some of the most important decisions are made and conversations occur. So I think that strong facilitation is really important, and having a really purposeful agenda as well means we can just keep bringing people back to what's important.
Brilliant, thank you. What advice would you give for junior members of the team who might be a little bit shy and don't want to talk over the directors?
Yeah, it can be quite daunting, can't you, when you're the least experienced person at the meeting? And often you find that those people, those junior people, leave a meeting regretting what they didn't say, because they might have had some great ideas or questions, but weren't, they were thinking it through about what should I say, how should I say it, and then the opportunity is gone. I find personally with experience, I'm more likely to regret what I did say in a meeting. But in terms of bringing those junior people in, maybe again we can prime them before the meeting and say that great idea that you have, or that think about some great questions that you can put out there, and I'll come to you at this point in the agenda. I'll come to you and ask your opinion, so we can really showcase their experience and their knowledge, but we bring them in, so we give them a bit of an opportunity to say what they need to say. But I think helping them prepare and saying, okay, so Andrew, what are your thoughts on that? Because I know you had a really great idea. Just helps them have a voice.
Thank you. And somebody's wrote about the 20/80 rule, where a chair should talk for 20% less than everyone else. What do you think about that?
I have heard about this before. I don't think there's any rule that we can follow in terms of how many people, or sort of how, yeah, who should talk for how much time. It really depends on the meeting, how many people are there, the formality or informality facilitator, because sometimes the facilitator's role is purely to facilitate and not add any content or opinion at all, whereas sometimes the facilitator has a lot more that they need to contribute. So unfortunately there is no hard and fast formula here, if only there were.
Thank you very much, and that we've run out of time. Thank you, Catherine, and thank you everyone for attending today's webinar.